Hello guys, today we are going to learn about the anatomy of iris. So iris is the anteriormost part of the uveal tract. It is thin and circular structure which is formed by the diaphragm-like structure in front of the crystalline lens. The diaphragm which is formed by the iris which contain the central aperture, it's known as pupil. The location of the pupil is not exactly central, it's little nasal to the center. The normal size of the pupil aperture measuring about 4 mm. Now here in this diagram you can see the brown color portion is iris and in central black portion is pupil, and this is the limbus, the junction of the cornea and sclera, and this is the sclera, the white portion, and this are the rectus muscles. Now the iris is attached to the middle of the anterior surface of the ciliary body. Iris dividing the space in front of the lens into the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. Before going to the diagram, it is important when pupil is constructed, the posterior surface of the iris will more contact with the lens capsule, and when pupil is fully dilated, iris may not touch the lens. Now diagram. Here in this diagram you can see iris is attached to the middle of the anterior surface of the ciliary body, and the iris which is present in front of the lens, and the iris is dividing the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. Now we are going to see topography of the iris. Average diameter of iris is 10 to 11 mm. It is the thickest at collarate, which is located approximately 1.5 mm from the pupillary margin, and thinnest at the iris root. So what is iris root? Iris root is the part of iris which join with the ciliary body, and the thickness of the iris root is approximately 0.5 mm. Anterior surface of the iris is dividing into the pupillary zone and the ciliary zone by a circular rigidity. Location located 1.5 mm away from the pupillary margin, which called as collarata, and it's also known as iris frill. Okay. Now next, in this diagram you can see iris, it is thickest at collarata, and this collarate which is located 1.5 mm from the pupillary margin. This is the pupillary margin and this is collarate, which is also known as iris, as I already told you. And one more point, this collarate is the site of foetal pupillary membrane attachment. Below the pupil, this is the pupillary region and this is ciliary region, and below the ciliary region there is presence of iris root. Iris root whose thickness is 0.5 mm, and this iris root form a thinnest part of the iris, and this root joins with the ciliary body, and during blunt trauma, damage to iris occur most common at the iris root, where the iris rips all away from the ciliary body. Now next part of iris. Now we are going to see the parts of iris. In that, first, pupillary zone. Pupillary zone extends from pupillary margin to collarate. It is in the above diagram you can see from pupillary margin to collarate, it is a pupillary zone. This pupillary zone is relatively flat, and pupillary margin which is marked by a dark border, it's known as pupillary roof. Here in this diagram you can see this is a pupillary roof which is marked by a dark border. The pupillary roof is the anterior termination of the pigmented layer. Now, the second part of the iris, which is ciliary zone. Now, the ciliary zone of the iris, it extended from collarate to iris root. In above diagram, you can see it extended from collarate to iris root. These are some depression and pit arrangement in a row present in these areas known as crypt. Now in this diagram you can see some depression or pit arrangement in row are known as crypts. These crypts are found in two locations. Now the first, those present near collarate are relatively larger and they are known as Fuchs crypt. And second, few are seen in periphery of the iris. And during in laser iridotomy, the opening is created in area of iris crypt because as it requires less amount of energy in those thickness areas and thickness area of iris thinnest area of the iris thickness. Now the microscopic structure of the iris, in that first we are going to see anterior limiting layer. Anterior limiting layer lines the iris and is the anteriormost consideration of the iris stroma. The layer consists of mainly fibroblast and melanocyte, and these cells of fibroblast and melanocytes are arranged in a meshwork. These fibroblasts are located on the surface of melanocyte which beneathing them. Now the color of iris, which depend on the thickness of the layer and melanocyte disposed in the anterior limiting layer. The color of the iris are largely determined by the three variables. First is the density and the structure of the iris stroma. Second, the pigmented epithelium. Third, the pigment contained granule within the melanocyte of the iris stroma. And one more point that is important, the neovascularization of the iris which occurs in the anterior limiting layers. Now the heterochromia. As the name suggests, hetero means different, chromia means color, so the different color. And this heterochromia, it is of two kinds. First is incomplete heterochromia, in that one of the iris is different color from the other. Second is partial heterochromia or sectorial. It is heterochromia, parts of one iris is a different color from its remainder. Now this is the structure of iris and the ciliary body. This is cornea, this is sclera, the depression area which known as crypt, the main bulk of iris tissue which forms the iris stroma. This is the pigment epithelium, this is lens, pars plana, this is epithelium, and this is the ciliary muscles. Now second microscopic structure of the iris is iris stroma. The iris stroma, which is form the main bulk of iris tissue and contains sphincter, pupillary, dilated pupillary muscles, vessels, and the nerves. In this diagram you can see iris stroma which contains sphincter, pupillary, dilated pupillary, vessels, and the nerves. Now cells in the iris stroma, pigmented cell which contains melanocyte and clump cell, non-pigmented cell which contain fibroblast, lymphocyte, macrophage, and the mast cell. Now we are going to see the muscles in the iris stroma. In that first is sphincter pupillary muscles. This sphincter pupillary muscle is a circular muscle 0.75 to 1 millimeter wide, composed of smooth muscle cell. The muscle is 0.1 to 0.1.7 millimeter in thickness and it considerable thicker than the dilated pupillary. It encircles the pupil and it's located in the pupillary zone of the stroma. This sphincter muscle is firmly adherent to the surrounding structure of the iris. Sphincter muscle is composed of spindle-shaped cells that are oriented parallel to the pupillary margin. So, contraction of sphincter causes the pupil to constrict, and this process is meiosis. The muscles is innervated by the parasympathetic. The sphincter pupillary retains its function even after several radicals because of its unique distribution of the fiber. Now the next second is dilated pupillary muscle, which extend from the iris root to point in the stroma to a point in the stroma below the midpoint of the sphincter, has dense band of connecting tissue, and it separates the sphincter and the dilated muscle from each other. Because of the radial arrangement of the fibers of the muscles, contraction of dilated pupillary muscles pulls the pupillary portion towards the root, thereby enlarging the size of the pupil, and the process is known as microsis. And this dilated pupillary muscle is sympathetic innervation. Now the next is blood vessels in the iris stroma. Iris arteries are the branch of major circular artery located in a circular body near the iris root. These iris vessels usually follow the radial course from the iris root to the pupillary margin. These vessels are surrounded by the dense network of collagen fibrils, which is embedded into the collagen network of the stroma. Such arrangement of collagen network prevent the iris frown and compression during the extensive iris movement during the construction and the dilation of the pupil. Iris wings have very thin wall consist of endothelium surrounding by a thin layer of collagen. Thank you guys for watching my video. Please like, share and subscribe my channel.